It's a little bit warmer in here than it is out there, so that's got to be a good thing. And I'm impressed that you're not dissuaded by the marble-sized hailstones that have been falling around the streets this afternoon. Tonight's topic is the finger of God, the miracles of Jesus. And if you haven't picked up one of these sheets in the foyer, this is the revamped schedule, and it replaces the one that's been glued to the front of your book if you've got one of the books, and it better reflects the weeks and the dates that we're now using. So if you haven't got one of those, you can pick one up in the foyer at the break. When the break comes, I invite you to move swiftly across to the hall next door, through the cold and biting rain, and to pick up your hot beverage and move through into the large hall space. And that way we'll all fit in comfortably and enjoy that break time before returning again promptly back in here at about 20:15. So without further ado, please welcome Chris Marshall.
Well, thank you for coming back for a third week, those who have been here for 3 weeks. The weather gods have really been conspiring against this series, with the first one being cancelled because of the snow, and tonight's one probably ought to be cancelled because of the hail, but it's good that you have braved the weather. I want to leave some time at the end of the second lecture for questions, so if there's anything that comes up that you don't understand or don't agree with, store it away, and we'll try and we'll try and leave some time at the end for any comments or questions. But difficult to do it as we go, because you'll ask questions and I'll say, well, I'm going to get to that later on, so let me get all what I know out on the table, then you can respond. So we're talking about the miracles of Jesus and their meaning this evening. So let me begin with just a few introductory observations. It's not really possible to read the Gospels without being impressed by the huge number of episodes and sayings in the Gospel tradition that deal with miracles of one kind or another. The miracles play such a prominent and complex and important role in the Jesus story that we simply can't avoid discussing them, despite the fact that they raise all kinds of awkward questions. In fact, as we will see, the central place ascribed to the miraculous deeds in the life of Jesus is one of the most distinctive, even unique, and that's a word that I think we use a bit too easily when we talk about things. At the end of the day, nothing is entirely unique, but this really is something that is distinctive and perhaps even unique as an aspect of the Jesus story. There is no other religious figure in antiquity, either historical or mythological, that has attracted such a concentration of miracle stories around him and around his reputation. Of course, the presence of the miracle material in the Gospel accounts elicits different reactions from different people. Some people give huge emphasis to the miracles, insisting that it is the miracles that prove Jesus' unique status as the divine Son of God. And there is a long tradition in Christian theology and Christian apologetics that's appealed to the miracles as the firmest evidence we have for Christian faith. Other people respond with enormous skepticism towards the miracle material, especially modern academics. Since we know that genuine miracles simply do not happen, remarkable things may happen that we find difficult to explain, but genuine miracles don't really happen, then those that are ascribed to Jesus in the Gospels must be the stuff of legend and fantasy and mythology. There are even many committed, sincere Christians that worry in the middle of the night that this might actually be the case, and respond to the miracle stories with a sort of embarrassment, kind of wish they weren't there. They want others to take Christian faith seriously, but the miracles are a kind of obstacle to commending Christian faith to educated people in a scientific age. And so the best scheme is to try and ignore them, or perhaps to rationalise them, to treat these episodes as symbols or parables that disclose spiritual truths rather than real historical events. Liberal Christianity in particular has long preferred Jesus the teacher to Jesus the miracle worker, and especially to Jesus the exorcist, which is too spooky by far. And even modern sort of activist radical Christianity prefers Jesus the prophet to Jesus the miracle worker or Jesus the exorcist. When people raise the question of Jesus' miracles and Jesus as a miracle worker, most discussion tends to focus on the question of historicity. Did Jesus of Nazareth really perform the miraculous deeds that are ascribed to him? Now that's an important question, and I do want to consider it briefly this evening, but it's only one of four questions I want to consider in this lecture. I want to talk about the miracles of Jesus really from these four perspectives. We probably only get through three, but here's the four questions I want to consider this evening. First, I want to consider the miracles in their first century context, to try and locate them, if you like, in the worldview and the understanding of the people of Jesus' day in the first century. Then I do want to talk a bit about the question of historicity. Can we be sure that these things happened? Did they happen? I want to spend most time, however, talking about the meaning of the miracles, the theological meaning of the miracles, and then, if we have time, and we probably won't, to talk about the way the miracles functioned to communicate the message that Jesus felt charged with proclaiming. So that's where we're going to go. Great teaching methodology, this, to sort of map out where we're going to go and then go there. So that's where we're going to go. Let's begin then by talking about the first century context in which the miracles are to be understood. And here's just one way of doing it. It's like most things I've pinched from somebody else, but it's one that I think crystallises the issues very well. In the first century world, in the first century Greco-Roman world and world of first century Judaism, there were really three main strategies for dealing with sickness and for trying to restore human well-being. The three strategies all start with M. There was medicine, there was magic, and there was miracle. Let me talk a little bit about each. Medicine is where healing is sought through aiding or enhancing the natural functioning of the human body. Whether it's by drugs or by herbs or by surgery or by manipulation or by whatever, medicine is characterized by working on the human body to promote its own ability to heal itself. Magic is where healing or restoration is sought through some sort of mysterious techniques that afford the person who uses their techniques protection from the hostile cosmic forces that have caused the sickness. This is part of the magical worldview. It's still alive and well in some parts of the world, that when bad things happen, it's because there are these malevolent spiritual powers, cosmic powers, that cause them to happen. And the way to get protection, sorry, I got something on my tongue. The way to get protection from these cosmic powers is through charms or spells or incantations or secret recipes or secret knowledge that gives you the ability to control these malevolent powers. Miracle is where healing is sought through divine intervention, where the person who needs healing looks to God or to the gods or to the healing gods or to the agents of God to bring about healing in response to prayer, to response to some human appeal. So it was common in the Greco-Roman world to go to healing shrines where gods of healing could be appealed to in order to bring restoration. Medicine, magic, or miracle. Now, of course, this is just an academic's way of categorising a reality that's much more complex than that. There would have been considerable overlap between these strategies. A physician, for example, might well understand the medical skills that he possessed as a gift of the gods. Or a physician may use magical techniques as part of his repertoire for bringing about healing. But in any particular attempt to secure recovery, one or other of these strategies would have been uppermost, would have had priority. In medicine, the patient seeks healing through facilitating the natural properties of the body. In magic, the recipient seeks healing through exploiting or controlling the network of cosmic powers that is causing the problem. It's a bit like New Age methodologies today. In miracle, the patient seeks remedy through direct intervention of the deity. Now, according to the Gospels, Jesus' exclusive strategy for dealing with sickness was miracle. Jesus never relies on magical practices. Now, there are some scholars who have claimed that Jesus was a magician and that he could be categorised in the pigeonhole of magic in the first century. But they usually do that by defining magic in a very broad way, so that if anything unusual is ascribed to a person, they must be a magician. In actual fact, Jesus is never called a magician in the New Testament, nor is he ever accused of magic, even by his bitterest enemies. So although there is a book that I remember reading many years ago when I was doing my doctoral work called Jesus the Magician, Jesus wasn't a magician, and he wasn't regarded as being a magician in his own day, and he could easily have been, but the evidence suggests he wasn't. Nor do we have, and perhaps the evidence here is a little more ambiguous, but we have no firm evidence of Jesus employing known medical techniques or known medical language in order to secure healing. Now, true, there are 3 occasions in which Jesus is said to have used saliva in trying to secure healing. He made little mud packs and put it in the man's ears on one occasion. And some have thought that this may be a sign of Jesus using a first century medical technique. But that's by no means certain. And really the experts are not agreed as to why on these 3 exceptional occasions Jesus is portrayed as using saliva. But I think we can be fairly clear that Jesus, just as he was not regarded as a magician by his contemporaries, nor was he regarded as a doctor. Interestingly, any doctors in the audience, please block your ears at this point. But interestingly, doctors are portrayed in a very critical light in the New Testament. The word physician is used on 7 occasions in the New Testament, and 6 are negative. For example, in the story of the woman with persistent hemorrhaging in Mark chapter 5, Mark says of this woman, "She had endured much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had. And she was no better, but rather grew worse." So there's a doctor for you. You have to endure their treatment, they charge the earth, and you end up being worse off. Sounds very modern, doesn't it? Doctors caused the pain, aggravated her condition, and bankrupted her. And that's kind of typical of the way doctors are regarded generally in the Bible. It changes a bit after the biblical period. So, in the Gospels, Jesus is consistently portrayed not as a magician or as a doctor, but as a miracle worker, as a bearer of miraculous power, as an agent of divine intervention. And whether we like it or not, the miracles have an extraordinarily dominant place in the gospel presentation of Jesus' ministry. an extraordinarily dominant place in the presentation of the career of Jesus. To underline that fact, I just want to draw attention to 4 observations which confirm just how important the miracles are to the way in which the Jesus story is told. The first is the sheer amount of space that is devoted in the gospel tradition to telling the stories of miracles. One scholar speaks of, and I quote, the enormous and all-pervading presence of miracles in the 4 Gospels. The enormous and all-pervading presence of miracles. Almost 1/3 of the Gospel of Mark, that's about 209 verses out of about 606 verses, almost 1/3 of Mark is given over to miraculous occurrences. And when you realise that from Mark 11 onwards, Mark is really occupied with just 3 days in Jesus' life, so that most of Jesus' story is told in chapters 1 to 10. In the chapters 1 to 10, almost half of Mark's content, 42% of the content, deals with miracles or miracle sayings of one kind or another, 200 out of 425 verses. Miracles occur in every layer of the gospel tradition. Scholars can go through and identify blocks of material that seem to have come from the same source. And in every one of those sources we find miracles being recorded. There are at least 30 different miracle stories recorded in the 4 Gospels, at least 30 different episodes. And the evangelists claim to be presenting just a representative sample of what they had available to them. And the impact of these individual stories, as many as they are, and that's a lot, we'll come back to this point several times tonight, that's a lot of stories to be associated with one person. And the impact of that clutch of stories is enhanced by sort of editorial summary statements that the gospel writers pop in at different points as they tell the story. I'll give you a good example. This is from Mark chapter 6. Have I got this on here? No, I don't. When they had crossed over, they came to the land of Gennesaret and moored the boat. When they got out the boat, people at once recognized him and rushed about that whole region and began to bring the sick on mats to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he went, into villages or cities or farms, they laid the sick in the marketplaces and begged him that they might touch even the fringe of his cloak. And all who touched it were healed. That's just one of, maybe 7 or 8 summary statements. There's no individual story told there. It's just like the gospel writer sort of stops and says this thing was happening all over the show. Everywhere that Jesus went, the people brought their sick into the streets and asked Jesus to heal them. So, first observation, the Gospels are dominated by references to the miracles. Second observation, there is a huge variety of miracles associated with Jesus. He displays a remarkable range of miraculous powers. He doesn't just have one speciality. Now, I remember going back 20 or 30 years ago when miracle workers came to town and their favourite speciality was lengthening people's legs. And if anybody had any ailment in the upper part of the body, it was because one leg was shorter than the other. And so that was the miracle of the day. You don't find that with Jesus. There is no one thing that he sort of specialises in. He seems to address problems across the whole range of human need. Now, scholars usually divide the miracle tradition into these 3 categories. There's exorcisms, that's the casting out of evil spirits, and these are very frequent in the Gospels as well, especially in Mark and in Luke. There are 6 individual exorcism stories, then lots of other references to Jesus the exorcist. Then there are healings, of which there are at least 17 different stories, and usually in the healings there are the 3 occasions which Jesus said to have raised the dead are included. And then there are nature miracles. That's the calming of storms, walking on water, multiplying bread, turning water into wine, cursing the fig tree, and so on, of which which there are at least 8 different stories. Now, this is a somewhat arbitrary way of classifying the material, and again, some episodes don't fall into just one category. There are a number of healings that apparently involved exorcism. The raising of the dead is a kind of nature miracle when you think about it, turning back the power of death. And it would be possible to use other classifications if you wanted to categorise the miracle tradition. For example, you could distinguish between those that are performed by physical contact and those that are performed by word, or those that are performed directly on the patient versus those that are vicarious. There are a number of stories where somebody comes and says, please heal my servant, or please heal my daughter, and Jesus sort of heals at a distance. So there's a variety of ways you could divide up the material. This is the most common one, just because the first rule of any kind of analysis is categorization, and this is the one that scholars usually use. But the point I just want to underline is that the Gospel writers ascribe a huge diversity of miraculous deeds to Jesus. And that is a very important observation, and I'll come back to it later because it is a clue as to what these miracles mean. At this point, I'm building a brick wall here. At this point at the foundation, let's just observe that the variety of deeds ascribed to Jesus underlines the importance of this material to appreciating his ministry. Third observation. There is a close connection established in the Gospels between the miracles of Jesus and the teaching of Jesus. So that the miracles, if you like, illustrate his teaching. Illustrate is not the best word. The miracles sort of enact his teaching, embody his teaching, whilst his teaching explains his miracles. They are two sides of the same coin. And the best example of this is in Mark chapter 1, where Mark takes the very first miracle that Jesus performs in his account, and he brackets it with the very first reference he makes to Jesus' teaching. So if you listen carefully, and Mark loves these sort of bracketing arrangements, he says, teaching, miracle, teaching. It's very technically called a sandwich arrangement because you have these two outer bits sandwiching the inside bit. Very common in Mark. He loves putting one story into the middle of another. But listen to this. This is just after he's arrived on the scene, been baptised, come back into his ministry. And Mark chapter 1 verse 22 reads like this. Have I got it on here or not? No, I haven't. So I've got symbols in my notes down where the PowerPoint slides are, but they don't correspond with where the slides are. They went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, he entered the synagogue and taught. They were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority, and not as the scribes. Just then there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." And the unclean spirit, throwing him into convulsions and crying with a loud voice, came out of him. And they were all amazed, and they kept on asking one another, "What is this, a new teaching with authority? He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." Teaching, miraculous deed, teaching. The miracles are part and parcel of Jesus' larger teaching, preaching ministry. They're not a superfluous add-on, dispensable feature that you can just sort of lift off because it's embarrassing and just stick with the teaching. They are so closely connected that you really can't have one without the other as far as the gospel writers are concerned. And then my fourth observation, to underline the importance of this material, is just to make a comment about the extensive terminology that is employed in the Gospels to depict the miracles of Jesus. The Gospel writers use a range of terms to describe Jesus' deeds, terms that indicate that these are not just cheap party tricks, but they are full of theological meaning. The most common terms that are used in the Gospels are these. In the Synoptic Gospels, that's in Matthew, Mark and Luke, the word that is most frequently used to describe the mighty deeds of Jesus is the word dunamis, which is literally means powers or mighty deeds. It's the plural of the singular noun dunamis, which means power. So dunamis is power, dunamis is powers. The singular dunamis, power, is characteristically associated with God. So when Jesus, for example, is on trial before the Sanhedrin and he is interrogated about his sense of identity, and he eventually says, I am, are you the Messiah, the Son of God? And eventually says, I am, and you will see, he goes on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power, dunamis, capital P. And so to describe the miracles of Jesus as dunamis is to imply that they are powers of God. They are embodiments of divine dunamis, embodiments of divine power. They are acts of God. They are not just tricks of the trade. In the Gospel of John, the term that is his favourite for describing the wonderful deeds of Jesus is the word semeia, which means signs or signifiers. John, for some reason, doesn't use the word dunamis. He refers the word signs, which again implies that these deeds have a significance. You think of the word significance, the first part of it is the word sign. The deeds that carry meaning, they point to something beyond themselves. They carry a meaning that's open to those who are spiritually alert to what's being disclosed here. So again, John's term implies that there's something more going on than just somebody sort of impressing people with his party tricks. And then one other phrase worth noting, which we find particularly in the book of Acts, is the stock phrase, signs and wonders, or I've translated their deeds of liberation. It's a phrase that is drawn from the Exodus story in the Old Testament, where God intervenes to rescue the people of Israel from oppression and captivity in Egypt by working all kinds of signs and wonders to try and get Pharaoh to change his mind, deeds that will eventually lead to the liberation of his enslaved people. To refer to the miracles of Jesus as signs and wonders is to imply they are of comparable significance to what happened at the time of Moses. So the terminology that the gospel writers use underscores the importance of the miracles for understanding the mission of Jesus. They are understood as expressions of divine power that have a meaning or significance. They point to something beyond themselves, and they serve as revelations of God's saving and delivering justice. Just the language that's used to identify these deeds already indicates that they have enormous meaning for understanding Jesus. Let me just draw these threads together then. I hope I've convinced you that the miracle material has enormous importance for understanding the Jesus story. Now, previous generations of New Testament scholars, especially in the 19th and early 20th century, were highly embarrassed by this. This did not go down well in the dawning scientific age. They often argued that the miracle stories in the Gospels were sort of later legendary additions to the life of Jesus. That as the story of Jesus had spread from Galilee and Judea into the wider Hellenistic world, Jesus had to sort of match it with the heroes of Greek mythology. And so these stories grew up to kind of muscle them up so that the story would have more impact in the pagan world. And that what we need to do really is discard these pagan fairy tales and instead concentrate on Jesus the prophet, or Jesus the ethical teacher, Jesus the moral or spiritual guru. Today, however, all New Testament scholars of whatever theological stripe they bear accept that this simply cannot be done without doing violence to our sources. As one scholar writes, and I quote, "The liberal picture of Jesus as simply an enlightened humanitarian religious teacher is a figment of the imagination. We cannot treat the miracles of Jesus as late additions to the traditions about Jesus that were modelled on stories from the Greek and Roman world. It is not as if the original historical Jesus was a holy and wise teacher who was later turned into a miracle worker. Rather, he was perceived to be from the very beginning a worker of signs and wonders that were bound up with his teaching and claims to authority. Thus, the issue shifts from that of whether Jesus was a wonder worker or not to the question of the power by which Jesus did such things. So, I think all scholars today, all historical Jesus scholars accept, and we'll see in a moment why, that the miracle material is so embedded in the sources that we have to do with Jesus that we simply cannot conveniently ignore it or lift it off and be left behind with a much more palatable Jesus. So this brings us then, secondly, to the question of historicity. Let's begin with this word miracle. Now, what I'm going to say in the next 5 or 10 minutes is not really very highly specialist or philosophical or very tight. It's just a few observations which I just think want to really end up with making the point that whether or not we think Jesus did these deeds is actually a theological rather than a historical question. That's where I'm going. But let me begin by just reflecting on this term miracle. We use the word miracle today, it seems to me, in both a loose sense and in a strict or technical sense. We use the term loosely to refer to remarkable orderings of circumstances and events to produce rather unexpected outcomes or improbable outcomes. And I mean, this use of the term happens virtually every night on television news. We might talk about somebody in a car accident who has a miraculous escape and are not killed as you would expect them to be killed. Or we might speak of people in the Christchurch earthquake who were miraculously saved from disaster. Or in 9/11, there's been stories about people who would have been up the tower had they not slept in. And they weren't. Or they were up the tower, but they were protected by a stairwell and miraculously saved from death. Or we might speak of a baby surviving complications at birth. We might even speak of the miracle of evolution. So we use the term quite frequently in this loose sense. And by it, we don't mean that there has been a violation of the laws of nature, the regular laws of nature that we take for granted, or that the common cause and effect mechanism that controls everyday events hasn't worked. Rather, we are referring to a sort of unusual ordering of circumstances to produce a rather surprising outcome, an exceptional outcome. Now, this really creates no philosophical problems for us. We all know that unexpected or fortuitous or apparently random things happen all the time. So in this loose sense, if we say it was a miracle that I wasn't run over on the street today when all that ice came down, we really mean it was as though it were a miracle. It was so unexpected, it was as though it was a miracle, rather than it actually being a miracle in the strict sense. So that loose use of the term, I think, is one that is very common and really creates no particular problems. More strictly, however, when philosophers or theologians refer to events as miracles in the strict sense, they are referring to events that defy the laws of nature. Events that are empirically certain, they definitely happened, but are, if you like, conceptually impossible. They can't have happened because those sorts of things don't happen. To steal my own thunder from the climactic lecture in the series on the resurrection of Jesus, the main objection to the belief in the resurrection of Jesus is very simple. Dead men don't rise. We all know that. We all know that. We all know that death is final. To talk about somebody rising from death is literally miraculous if it happened. The laws of nature apparently have been, in some sense, suspended or contradicted. So, one of the leading Jesus scholars of our day, Roman Catholic scholar who's spending his life producing a massive multi-volume work called A Marginal Jew, in his chapter on the miracles, and it's a chapter that runs about 200 pages, so it's a book in itself, says this: a miracle is, 1, an unusual, startling or extraordinary event that is in principle perceivable by any interested or fair-minded observer. 2, an event that finds no reasonable explanation in human abilities or in any other known forces that operate in our world of time and space. And 3, an event that is a result of a special act of God, doing what no human power can do. So if we take this as a definition, just note that the word miracle in this definition is both an affirmation and an explanation. To call something a miracle is to affirm that something exceptional definitely happened. It's not just somebody who had a dream. It's not just a story, an urban legend that's grown up. Something definitely happened, and anybody there could have attested to that it happened. And on the other hand, it is to explain it by ascribing it to a divine source or a non-human source, something that does not just come out of natural laws of cause and effect. Now, this understanding of miracle, of course, raises a host of philosophical and theological difficulties. If one does not believe that God exists, or that God intervenes directly in human affairs, at least on some occasions, then, by definition, miracles cannot happen. So, miracles do not happen because they cannot happen, according to this definition, within a strictly naturalistic worldview. Apply that to the Jesus tradition, and we have to say Jesus cannot have performed genuine miracles because miracles don't happen. On the other hand, if one accepts that God does exist, and that God was distinctively present in the life of Jesus in some exceptional way, then miracles are conceptually quite feasible. Even if the world is routinely governed by the so-called laws of nature, God, from whom these laws stem, is always free to interrupt or suspend or override or modify the regular operation of things in order to achieve some special outcome. Or perhaps we could say that the laws of nature that God has created in order to run the creation are much more complex than we actually understand. And our experience of these laws of nature is very partial. And sometimes things can happen that we can't explain because they are beyond our understanding. I remember reading in the newspaper some scientist who had suggested that perhaps the human brain has not evolved enough to understand the nature of reality. I thought that's a really interesting question. Perhaps our brain hasn't evolved enough to really understand how complex reality really is. And it really relativizes our so-called certainties, doesn't it? Anyway, that's neither here nor there. So, the point I'm really wanting to make by this rather ham-fisted and amateur attempt at philosophy is that whether one accepts that the historical Jesus performed genuine miracles is actually a theological or a philosophical, it's not a historical judgment. All that historians can do is amass and assess the evidence that we have that certain remarkable events took place in the activity of Jesus. That's all a historian can do, is simply identify the evidence that extraordinary things were associated with the life of this person. But a historian cannot prove or disprove whether these extraordinary events are, strictly speaking, miraculous. In other words, that there is no other natural or human explanation for them. That really, ultimately, it seems to me, is a theological or philosophical judgment. On the historical question, which is whether Jesus was known for doing extraordinary deeds, however we explain them, on that historical question, critical historians today are remarkably united. John Meyer speaks for the scholarly consensus when he concludes his detailed study with these words. The curious upshot of our investigation is that, viewed globally, the tradition of Jesus' miracles is more firmly supported by the criteria of historicity than are a number of other well-known and often readily accepted traditions about his life and ministry. For example, his status as a carpenter, his use of Abba in prayer, his own prayer in Gethsemane before his arrest, things that critical historians usually don't question. Put dramatically, but with not too much exaggeration, if the miracle tradition from Jesus' public ministry were to be rejected in toto as unhistorical, so should every other gospel tradition about him. In sum, the statement that Jesus acted as and was viewed as an exorcist and healer during his ministry has as much historical corroboration as almost any other statement we can make about the Jesus of history. Now, John Meyer is not claiming that every miracle in the New Testament is historical. And he, speaking for himself, accepts that there is some legendary embellishment that has occurred in this material as it's been handed on. For example, Meyer denies the historicity of the so-called nature miracles. He doesn't accept that they happened. Also, we need to factor in that the gospel stories are inevitably told in terms of a pre-scientific worldview. And so it is conceivable that some psychological or social disorders may be ascribed to demon possession because that's how the first century worldview operated. So there's room to sort of debate this detail or that detail. Even so, Meyer insists, and I contend that he's speaking really for virtually all modern critical historical Jesus scholars, Meyer insists that Jesus' activity and fame as a healer and as an exorcist is one of the firmest pieces of historical evidence we have about him. However we explain them, Jesus was undeniably famous in his own day and in the generations that followed for the great works of power he was believed to perform. He was perceived to be a superior miracle worker. He was better than anybody else. And once again, I want to present you the evidence for that statement. Now, I think it needs to be said that Jesus was not unique in being perceived as somebody who worked miracles. He wasn't the only miracle worker on the block, to put it crudely. He's not the only miracle worker known to us in ancient sources. The Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, ascribes miracles to several people, although actually remarkably few when you stop and think about how big the Old Testament is. Really, there are not a lot of miracle stories in the Old Testament. And the ones that are there are concentrated in a couple of places. One is around the life of Moses in the Exodus, and the other is a number of stories associated with Elijah and Elisha. But healing stories are actually comparatively rare in the Old Testament, but there are miracle stories there, and they are associated with known historical figures. When we move into rabbinic literature, there are one or two charismatic rabbis who are recorded as performing miraculous deeds. And apparently Jews were admired in their day as being particularly good at exorcism. So you had a demon to drive out, best to find a Jewish exorcist because they seem to be pretty good at it. Josephus, the first century Jewish historian, mentions popular prophets who arose in the period leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, who promised signs and wonders of deliverance to people. Greco-Roman literature refers to miracle-working deities, and there were healing shrines devoted to these divinities throughout the world. And if all that's not enough, then just note what Jesus says about other miracle workers. Mark 13:22, false messiahs and false prophets will arise and show signs and wonders to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. Or Matthew 12:27, if I cast out demons by Beelzebul, by whom do your sons cast them out? Doesn't question that others do it. He's just saying, if I do it by the evil one, then who are your exorcists appealing to? Or Matthew 7, on that day many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do many deeds of power in your name? Then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you evildoers. So Jesus acknowledges that other people will work deeds of power as well. So he's not the only wonder worker known to us in ancient sources, but there are certain features associated with Jesus that set him apart from all other ancient parallels. And again, let me pick out 4. I've already mentioned the sheer amount of space in the Gospels that is devoted to the miracles. And I want to come back to that point. Some writers have given the impression, some historians have given the impression that miracle workers were a dime a dozen in Jesus' day. You go to down any street corner and find somebody who could work you a miracle for the right price. But that really exaggerates the evidence. Human miracle workers were far more limited than is often assumed. They weren't as common as hairdressers in the first century. In pagan literature, there are only 2 named individuals who have miraculous deeds ascribed to them in the New Testament period, 2 historical figures. One is a man called Apollonius of Tyana, who was a travelling teacher, preacher, and ascetic philosopher who was from the first century, was known to us through a 3rd century biography written by one Philostratus. The biography runs to 337 chapters, so it's a big work. Much of it has very little historical value, but there are some 9 miraculous deeds ascribed to Apollonius, although a number of them have clearly been borrowed from the Gospels. So the Gospel traditions now, a couple of 100 years into the Christian movement, these stories have been picked up and turned into sort of legends and then associated with Apollonius. But there are some stories associated with this figure. The other is Emperor Vespasian, who, according to Tacitus and Suetonius, cured 2 sick men in Alexandria in the year 69 or 70 of the Common Era, though the way they tell the story is that they kind of almost regard it as a sort of psychosomatic event, and even Vespasian himself was rather doubtful that anything had actually miraculous had happened. But the story goes that he cured 2 sick people who had a dream about how he could cure them if he did certain things to them. When we turn to Jewish literature from the first century, again there are only 2 named individuals who, from the time of Jesus, who have miracles associated with them. One is a man called Hananiah ben Dosa, who is said to have been able to tell whether sick people that he prayed for would be made well or whether they would die. He had a kind of foreknowledge about whether his prayers would work or not. And another is a man called Honi the Rainmaker, or some traditions call him Honi the Circle Drawer, who on one occasion prayed successfully for rain, drew a circle in the ground and stood in the circle until he had prayed for rain. So that really is it. There's 4 named historical figures from the first century that have miraculous deeds associated with them. So established miracle workers were not to a penny in Jesus' day, but more importantly, there is no other known miracle worker in antiquity who has so many miracles associated with them, nor such a success rate. And again, just even looking at the Gospels themselves, you get a feeling for this. How else do we explain Mark's description in Mark chapter 3 of huge crowds from Galilee and Judea and even foreign lands beyond the Jordan flocking out to see Jesus? Or the cry of the astonished onlookers in the Decapolis in Mark chapter 7. I love this phrase, Mark 7:37, he does all things well. He's good at everything. Or the crowd at Capernaum in Mark chapter 2, when Jesus heals the paralytic by pronouncing forgiveness of sins. We have never seen anything like this before. So the reaction of people was an indication that the quantity and the extraordinary success of Jesus' deeds set him apart in a category of his own. Then we have, as well as that, the range of miracles performed by Jesus. I'm going to make this point 3 times, and here's the second time. I've already commented that Jesus performed a huge range of deeds, from healing the sick to casting out demons to raising the dead to multiplying food to calming the storms and so on. The most common sorts of miraculous deeds ascribed to other wonder workers of Jesus' day were making it rain, not a talent we need much in Wellington, but in places where seasonal rainfall was all important for survival, it was a very welcome skill to have. Or secondly, correctly predicting future events. Surest way to gain a reputation in the Hellenistic world was to be able to predict future events. So, fortune telling, if you like, and rainmaking were the 2 most common deeds associated with miraculous events in the first century. Turn to Jesus, and the situation is radically different. On the one hand, as far as we know, he never made it rain. There are stories where he stopped storms and calmed the elements, but he did not procure rain, and he is extremely restrained in future predictions. There is no hint of astrology or fortune-telling in the gospel tradition. On the other hand, the deeds that are ascribed to him stand in a class of their own. For example, the healing of lameness, paralysis, blindness, and deafness is not attested in biblical or Jewish literature and is very rare in pagan material, but it is commonly ascribed to Jesus. The Gospels include 3 accounts of Jesus raising the dead. There is only one genuine parallel in the pagan sources. It's that Apollonius of Tyana again, who allegedly brought a young girl back to life who had died an hour before her wedding. She literally died of fright. But the story itself seems to be the conflation of 2 stories from the Gospels, combined and turned into a legendary story. The only other recorded cases we have are the stories of Elijah and Elisha in the Old Testament and stories of Peter and Paul in the book of Acts, both of whom are said to have raised the dead through prayer. So miracles that were exceptional or unheard of in the contemporary culture, especially in Jewish culture, were apparently quite common with Jesus. Again, it sets him apart. Third observation is the simplicity and the authority of Jesus' deeds. In parallel sources, miraculous deeds are accomplished through a huge expenditure of effort, required elaborate rituals or the use of special formula and incantations or the intensive prayer of especially holy people. When you look at the gospel accounts, what is really striking is the simplicity and the ease with which Jesus is said to have performed miraculous deeds. There is no elaborate routine, but most often he heals by a simple word of command or by a simple touch. Now, there are occasions where he uses a mud pack or uses saliva, but even in those stories, the emphasis falls on the immediacy of the cure. Every year when I teach this course, I am glad to re-encounter this material myself. And I remember a couple of years ago being struck over and over again in the Gospels, and it'll come through, I hope, in this next few lectures in this series as well, that the more closely you look at the Gospel material, you have this sort of twofold reality. On the one hand, you have these extraordinary things being said about Jesus, but it looks so natural for him. It just looks so ordinary when it's the stories about Jesus, but when you stand back and look at it, you see over and over again that there is something truly exceptional going on here. But it just seems as though it fits, the hat fits with Jesus in a way that to me looks, has signs of being something more than just how the gospel writers have chosen to tell the story. And then finally, there is a spiritual and moral seriousness about Jesus' miracles, which again is different than the miracle stories that we have in parallel sources. In pagan sources, the stories are often told with comical and burlesque features, and the storyteller often expresses doubt about the event or disapproval of the miracle worker for being greedy, for seeking payment for his services, and so on. When you look at the gospel tradition, there is a deep spiritual or moral seriousness that forms the horizon of the miracle reports, and this is evident in a number of ways. The events are not recounted in a flippant or in an ironic manner. There is very little attempt made to exaggerate the miracle or to add sensationalist details to the story. They just look so matter-of-fact when you read them. It doesn't come across as an attempt to sort of propagandize by creating these sort of fairy tales about Jesus. They just seem to be so matter-of-fact. Somebody has a need, they encounter Jesus, Jesus fixes the need, and that's it. Nor is there any excessive glorification of Jesus himself. In fact, the emphasis tends to fall, especially in the Gospel of Luke, on how the deeds of Jesus cause people to praise God, to be thankful that God was doing these deeds, or perhaps to accuse Jesus of blasphemy against God by doing these deeds. The deeds are linked in some way with the activity of God, not with Jesus being a superhero. One striking feature, and I can speak with a little bit more authority on this because this was the subject of my PhD thesis many years ago now, but it's the role of faith in the gospel stories. Faith is mentioned very rarely in pagan or Jewish accounts, and when it is mentioned, it's usually the result of having witnessed the deed. So people are sceptical, they see something extraordinary, and then they believe. Faith is the product of the deed. In the gospel tradition, there is considerable emphasis placed on the faith of the sick person as a prerequisite for the miracle. Jesus responds to the existence of faith by conferring healing. And the faith, I think, that is being spoken of here is not simply an act of credulity. It's not just, can you really believe that this is possible? And if you can, then hey, presto, press the button, you'll get your miracle. But rather, the faith that is spoken of, I think, is an attitude of spiritual receptivity. It's just that Jesus needed in the people that he was dealing with an openness to the meaning of what was happening, a receptivity to the presence of God. And when that receptivity was there, the miracle could achieve its purpose. It wasn't just, believe up to 51% and then, the tipping point's reached, you get your miracle. And that's how faith is sometimes spoken of in churches that practice these things today. I don't think that's how we should understand the faith that Jesus looked for. Jesus was looking for, I think, more of an openness on the part of the recipient to what God was doing in order for this miracle to have any real meaning. And perhaps most importantly, the miracle deeds of Jesus, miraculous deeds of Jesus, were an integral part of his preaching ministry. They carried a didactic, not just an apologetic significance. It wasn't just they proved that Jesus was important, they actually had something to say about what his message was trying to convey. They weren't intended to entertain or simply to impress. In fact, in Mark's Gospel in particular, people are often impressed, but to be impressed is not good enough. Just to be wowed is not good enough. You have to go beyond being wowed to actually penetrate the meaning of what's going on. The miracles weren't simply intended to entertain or impress. They were part of Jesus' call to moral change. They were intended to awaken repentance we spoke about last week. Just a couple of examples. This is from Matthew chapter 11, and I'll stop in just 1 minute. Then he began to reproach the cities in which he had done most of his deeds of power, because they did not repent. Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! For if the deeds of power done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. But I tell you, on the day of judgment it will be more tolerable for Tyre and Sidon than for you. And you, Capernaum, will you be exalted to heaven? No, you will be brought down to Hades. For if the deeds of power done in you had been done in Sodom, it would have remained until this day. But I tell you, on the day of judgment it will be more tolerable for the land of Sodom than for you. The deeds of power carried this moral challenge, and the fact that it was resisted was a cause of condemnation. So for Jesus then, there is a deep spiritual challenge associated with the miracles. They are not performed for sensational value. They're part of a larger agenda. Let me just sum up then, and then we can have a break. Jesus was not the only miracle worker known to us in ancient sources, but he stands in a class of his own. A.E. Harvey concludes his comparative analysis of this theme with these words: "We have come to the remarkable conclusion that the miraculous activity of Jesus conforms to no known pattern." And this explains the reputation that Jesus developed as a wonder worker. I've already mentioned the crowds that flocked to Jesus from all over the place, and the cries of amazement. They were all amazed and glorified God, saying, "We have never seen anything like this." They were astounded beyond measure, saying, "He has done everything well. He even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak." Lock that away in your memory, because we'll come back to that later on. In his own lifetime, Jesus had a reputation. I think, today we take for granted reputation because we get it 24 hours a day on television. Have you ever thought that people may have heard about Jesus, but they would never have recognised him because they couldn't see him on TV? It was much harder to build a reputation in the ancient world than it is in the modern world. But Jesus' reputation went ahead of him. And that implies that people were so impressed with what they saw that they spoke about him all the time. So that when people heard that this famous wonder worker was coming to town, they quickly saw the opportunity to get Granny made better again. So even in his lifetime, his reputation went ahead of him. After his death, his reputation as a miracle worker lived on. Decades later, the book of Acts tells us that Peter proclaimed the gospel to a Roman centurion called Cornelius. And he said to Cornelius, I'm not having to tell you something you haven't already heard of. You know how God anointed Jesus of Nazareth with the Holy Spirit and power, how he went about doing good and healing all who were oppressed by the devil, for God was with him. It doesn't say he taught wonderful moral principles. You know that Jesus was somebody who healed all who were oppressed by the devil, for God was with him. There is very little reference to Jesus in contemporary literature. We talked about this on the first night. And somewhat surprising to us that the ancient sources that we have hardly ever mention Jesus. What there is, however, is dominated by memory of his miracles. The Jewish historian Josephus writes of Jesus, about this time, from his great Antiquities of the Jews, about this time Jesus arose, a wise man, if indeed it be lawful to call him a man. Now, be suspicious of that sentence. It sounds a bit wrong, and in fact it is a bit wrong, because Christian copyists have slipped that in as they have copied Josephus. So that's a Christian interpolation. We know that now. Scholars often thought it was, but we now have evidence that it was. But Josephus goes on, "For he was a doer of wonderful deeds, and a teacher of men who gladly received the truth. He drew to himself many of both Jews and Gentiles. There are Christian interpolations in that passage, but the description of Jesus as a doer of wonderful deeds is authentic Josephus. There are two passages in the Babylonian Talmud which speak of Jesus. They claim that Jesus was executed for sorcery and for misleading the people. Here are the passages. Jesus was hanged on Passover Eve. For 40 days previously, a herald went forth and cried, "He is being led out for stoning because he practiced sorcery and led Israel astray and enticed them into apostasy. Whoever has anything to say in his defense, let him come and declare it." As nothing was brought forth in his defense, he was hanged on Passover Eve. Or the other reference to Jesus in the Talmud, Rabbi Joshua was reciting the Shema when Jesus came to him. He intended to receive him and made a sign to come to him. Jesus, thinking it was to repel him, went, put up a brick and worshipped it. "Repent," said Rabbi Joshua to Jesus. Jesus replied, "I have learned this from you. He who sins and causes others to sin is not afforded the means of repentance." And a rabbi has said, Jesus the Nazarene practiced magic and led Israel astray. So again, a recollection that Jesus did miraculous deeds, explained here hundreds of years later as sorcery, but nonetheless a memory that he did wonderful deeds. And later pagan writings such as Celsus also frequently accused Jesus of being a sorcerer. So it's not only the supporters of Jesus but also the opponents of Jesus and the opponents of the later Christian movement accept that Jesus was a remarkable wonder worker. He was remembered primarily as the doer of mighty deeds, which raises the question, why did Jesus perform so many miracles? Why? Why does the gospel tradition give such centrality to the powers of works of power that Jesus is said to do? What was his intention? We'll come back to that at 8:30. Thank you. I'm sorry I've gone a bit long, but it's a nice sort of pause point in the lecture.